Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 8th chapter in the book of Mark. We're going to cover the range of verses 27 through 38. The 8th chapter opens up with him surrounded by multitudes, and it closes with him in the private company of the disciple. In the opening part of the chapter, he is moved by compassion. Much of his miracles were motivated by compassion because these people had been with him for 3 days and they had nothing to eat. And the supply did not meet the demand. They had only 7 loaves of bread and a few few small fish, but he was more than enough to satisfy the demand with his miraculous touch. And they ate and were satisfied, and they picked up 7 large baskets of broken pieces. 8th verse, and those eating were about 4,000, and he dismissed them. This is recently he did feed a crowd of 5,000, but the numbers is not what's important. The fact is that there was no number too large for him not to feed. And also there's a lesson of resourcefulness. You got to recover. They had more left over than they had to begin with, so it was incumbent upon them to make the most and not squander what was left over for them to take. And then in verse 11, and the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from the heavens, trying him. The Pharisees were his primary religious antagonists. They were prominent at the synagogue level, and that's what they did every time they interacted with him. It was always and only always and only in a confrontational spirit. Here they try to trap him according to some doubtful utterance of reproach, and here they are asking for a miracle, a sign from heavens, and this was tempting him. So miracles can build faith, but to demand one or ask for one is evidence of unbelief, because you are tempting the God. In Deuteronomy 6:16 tells us not to do that. 6:13, I think. So the Pharisees were in the wrong spirit, and sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." The answer to the first question was because they were faithful, unbelieving, and the details and descriptions in the other synoptics are more diverse. So we read that he calls it an evil and adulterous generation that seeketh after a sign. So their seeking was motivated by unbelief. An unbelieving person will need a sign to supplement their lack of faith, whereas the faithful person will believe in spite of having seen a sign or any tangible evidence to that effect. So they would not get what they wanted. They would not get what they demanded because they did not deserve it. Their faith would be stagnant at the level that it stood, because that's all he could do for them. He can only work miracles. We read in the 6th chapter, in his own hometown of Nazareth, he could not work miracles because of the unbelief there. So if it was true for the denizens of his own town, it would be equally true for the Pharisees. Where there is unbelief, no miracle can flourish. Verse 15, and he was warning them, saying, "Mind, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod." Leaven is the physical phenomenon through which bread, which would otherwise be flat, that's what gives it its dough, its expansion is through the leaven. Yeast is another word for that. So what he's speaking of here now, earlier in the chapter we read of the bread, and we read more of that. The surrounding text indicates the disciples forgot to bring an ample amount of bread. So he's using this physical foundation for a metaphor of the spiritual influence, their contagious corruption, which we read of in Luke's version, 12:1, is hypocrisy. But here in Mark, he also makes mention of the Herodians were of the world. They were partisans of Herod, the Roman appointed king of Palestine. He was an Idumean and an idolater, and an immoral man. But the Pharisees and Herodians found themselves in league. The Pharisees would have been the patriots who would have resisted the resented Roman rule, whereas the Herodians would have been partisans of Rome. But so vehement was their hatred that they combined in conspiracy to get rid of this menacing presence, who was not the threat that they imagined or supposed. But he just chides their ignorance. Verse 18, having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear, and do you not remember. They are thinking on the physical, worldly level, and so they are unable to intuit the spiritual truth of what he's talking about in the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of the Herodians, and he likens it to the audience reaction who only came out for food, but they missed the miracle, they missed the spiritual sustenance. They were fed in their bellies, but they missed the true meaning of the miracle. Then verse 23, we find him journeying. Verse 22, rather, he's in Bethsaida, a place in Galilee, a town, and there's a blind beggar who wants him to touch him in the hopes of healing. And taking the blind man by the hand, he led him out of the village, and having spit on his eyes, laying hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see at all?" So there are no uniform motions and mechanics to the miracle of the Savior's healing of blindness. Sometimes he says the word, sometimes he touches. Here we find him using spitting on his eyes and then just laying his hands on the eyes. That is that was his process, but it is not instantly or thoroughly effective, at least not instantly. And he looked up and said, "I see men like trees walking." So he can see something, he notices a difference, but he's unable to discern the difference between men and trees, and physical objects would have been blurred. So his eyesight was not 20/20 or not even normal. He was still impaired, but he was improved from his foundation of blindness, but then he satisfies it with the finalizing stroke. Then he placed his hands upon his eyes again and made him look up, and he was restored and saw all clearly. So 2 times a charm, he placed his hands, once wasn't enough. There wasn't any limitation in his power. That's just the way that Providence arranged it, maybe to give the blind person an awareness of what lay ahead, what awaited him, and what he could hope and expect. So he's completely restored. Now, this man may have not been born blind by evidence of the restored. He may have once knew what sight looked like. In the 9th chapter of John, we read of a blind person who was blind from birth, but this could see all clearly, implicitly, as it once was. Then, 27th verse, this is the lesson itself. We find them in a different village near Caesarea Philippi. And Yahshua and his disciples went out to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, saying to them, "Who do men say that I am?" Caesarea Philippi would have been a town of pagan influence, Greek gods. Pan was worshipped there. It was also an epicenter of Baal worshiper. And it is not to be confused with Caesarea, the town founded by Philip's father, Herod the Great. That would have been the coastal city under the jurisdiction of Philip's brother, Herod Antipas. So he founded his own city. There was already, Baal worship, but this was not an instantly created city. It was just a renamed city, and he built upon it and improved it. Baal worshiper was there, but it was also a site of emperor worship. So it was only fitting and appropriate in this hotbed, this nest of polytheism, that the divine identity of the Savior be made plain and known. Now, if any of us were to ask the question, "Who do men say that I am?" that would be egotistical and wrong, because who we are in ourselves is of no consequence and no matter. But the Savior's identity is of critical significance, and there's a lot of misunderstanding which leads others away and astray and ultimately away from the source of their salvation. So the confession of the divine nature of the Savior is absolutely imperative for our salvation. So this question is of critical importance. Who do men say that I am? But he turns the tide on the question. He says, "Who do you say that I am?" That's the critical question. And they said to him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, but others one of the prophets." They're reciting the variety of popular opinion, and these were opinions, not convictions. We need an opinion is founded on error, but a conviction has an ironclad certainty. So John the Baptist, now Herod the ruler in the 6th chapter actually thinks that Yahshua is John the Baptist raised from the dead. So we do know that the myth that, they knew that John the Baptist had died, and Elijah, of course, was one of the 2 human beings to never have died. The only other human who has that distinction is Enoch from Genesis 5:24. But Elijah was prophesied to return in the book of Malachi towards the close of the Old Testament. And John the Baptist was the fulfillment of that. He wasn't Elijah reincarnated, but he spoke with the power and spirit of Elijah. He also subsisted on he wore camel skin, rough clothes, rough garbs, and subsisted on ascetic diets in the wilderness. So he was very much, and others said that he might have been the prophet. I think Jeremiah is one of the ones floated around in Matthew's account. And he said to them, "And you, who do you say I am?" And Peter answered, saying to him, "You are the Messiah." So he asked the you, the plural, to the 12 present, but there is one answer, that is Peter. He is very much the spokesman of the 12. He's assertive, confident, courageous, but often careless. But he is moved and animated by the conviction of the correct confession. You are the Messiah. That term features itself 7 times in the book of Mark, and only 3 are underlined in red, said by the Savior itself. We read of one in Mark 9:41 where he uses a title to itself. So the suppression, because the Messiah had nationalistic and political overtones, the suppression of it would have been pragmatic to do. So he commands them. Now he does not. He affirms the correctness of his confession implicitly, but more explicitly he tells him in verse 30, and he warned them that they should speak to no one about him. So Matthew's account is very much the standard for this this confession. He says, "Thou art the Messiah, the Son of the living Elohim." Now in Mark's account in 441, in the tempest and the storm at the sea, they say, "What manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" They had not yet come to the full recognition that he was the King of kings, Lord of lords, and God of very gods. So that does develop into the conviction of Peter by this point. He does have the correct confession. But the other thing we read in Matthew is just on this confession, which really elevates the significance of the confession of his divinity, is his church built. There's we're not going to get into the dynamics of the argument of the Catholic Church's claim for dissenting on that. We're just going to move on. "And he began to teach them that the Son of Man has to suffer much and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and to be killed, and after 3 days raised again." Son of Man appears 81 times in the Gospels, the total, all 4 Gospels. It is a term whose origin is found in Daniel, one of the major prophets, 7:13, and is distinct from what we read of in the book of Ezekiel, the Son of Man, lowercase. Here it is. So Ezekiel's title emphasizes his humanity, as does the Son of Man's, the Messiah, but his divinity is indicated by the capitalization of the term. And so the Son of Man, now the Redeemer, was to be born of a woman from Eve's loins, we read of in Genesis 3:15. But the Redeemer had to suffer much, and this upset, offended, and was an alien conception to the conventional prevailing understanding of the Jewish Messiah. They envisioned him as a conquering king, a victorious conqueror, but here he is put to death by his own people, the elders, the chief priest, and the scribes. These are the 3 people who would have been operative in the Sanhedrin. The elders would have been the lay leaders who would have been prominent, and the chief priest would have been the top of the pecking order. It was at his behest and insistence, we read of in John's 11th chapter, that one man should die so that the nation should live. And the scribes would have been, the Pharisees and the scribes were closely connected. They would have been all throughout the synagogue level. These would have been the copyists of the written laws of Moses and the rabbinical interpretation. So these 3 would combine in conspiracy to kill him because they rejected him. They rejected his claim. They rejected what Peter had earlier confessed, the correct confession that he was the Messiah, he was the Son of God. We don't read that here, but Peter does make that confession in Matthew's account. and describes the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the high priest and the elders just rejected it because it threatened, it just completely undermined their corrupt system, and they're in place in it. But he's going to be killed. But what's interesting is that he promises that he would not only suffer but also be killed. So he was the suffering servant in the mold of Isaiah 53, and there's 4 suffering songs and servant songs in Isaiah. But 3 days he will raise again, and so the death was necessary in order to bring about his resurrection. The resurrection is the greatest miracle of all, the central, most crucial claim in Christianity, and it happened because it was providentially designed. So the suffering servant was not without reason. Peter nevertheless violently resists the notion of the suffering servant. And he was speaking about this openly. Then Peter, taking him aside, began to rebuke him. So Peter, he has the intimate access. He is the most loyal lieutenant, the most trusted and beloved of the disciples. He takes him aside and rebukes him. He says, this ought not be. This has no place in my picture of who you are and what I just came to the correct confession. So how quickly does Peter deviate to the opposite extreme? He's saying that flesh and blood have not revealed the correct confession of his divine identity in Matthew's account, but in the 33rd verse we read that he is called Satan. So from going from flesh and blood has not revealed you, that means that God has revealed to you. Now he's speaking like Satan. And turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for your thoughts are not those of Elohim, but those of men." He says the exact same thing to Satan himself in the temptation stories when he offers him the world, or he offers him the crown, the world, all he'd have to do in exchange for submission to his worship. But Peter offers the same line of thinking, the shortcut, the crown without the cross, the splendor without the suffering. But the positive elements are only possible and allowable because he underwent the negative. And so he was thinking like the world, like those of men. He tried to offer him the same shortcut, and he was that is exactly what Satan offered, and Satan wanted it. So Peter was not demon possessed, he was not a Satan worshiper, but it just shows that even the most devoted disciples are not immune to satanic infiltration. And one of the ways that he gets into influences us is by getting into our minds, planting sick thoughts, and just tempting us with them. And calling near the crowd with his disciples, he said to them, "Whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." These are the 3 stepping stones for discipleship. If you have the desire, that is all well and good, but you must know the price. He doesn't want any illusions, any phony gimmicks or empty promises of what it means to be his disciple. You have to deny yourselves. You cease to be a self-centered, self-oriented creature, dominated by the desires of the fulfillments of your own immediate gratification and self-interest. You have to get rid of self in order to come after him. And then you have to take up your cross. The cross, the act of taking up the cross would have been an act of submission and humiliation. The Romans forced the capital offenders, guilty of capital crimes, to take up their cross, the 250-pound cross on their backs, carry it in abject surrender and humiliation to the stake, and then they would be crucified on it. He's talking now that the cross was a very literal threat to 1st century, 2nd century, and 3rd century disciples, but Constantine outlawed the cross. But he's also speaking it in a metaphorical sense. We have to take up our cross, we have to submit to him, surrender to him, die daily to him, and then we can follow him. So just as there had to be the suffering in his life, we have to suffer daily in order to follow him. For whoever desires to save his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life for the sake of me and the good news, he shall save it. So our self-denial is not to be to the exclusion of self-preservation, but neither is our self-preservation so paramount as to be the primary priority and focus, because if we value, treasure, and esteem our own life as we now know it, the life that we have on earth above and beyond anything else, we will forfeit that which we treasure most and esteem most in eternity. So beyond this life, there is a life beyond, and if you lose your life for the sake of me, this is the martyr's call. This is something one does not sign up for. This is something that one is called for. But you are guaranteed the crown of the martyr. Crown speaks of salvific significance. So the crown of the martyr belongs to those who willingly forsake their lives for his cause. For what shall it profit a man if he gains all the world and loses his own life? What gain is there for the world which will one day vanish and perish, and your own life, your own soul? The soul is immortal. That's how it's more familiarly translated. So you have to have the world and all that it offers is as nothing. Even if you had the whole world, you're holding on to something which is perishable, and all that the world has to offer cannot compare to the miracle of salvation. So you don't want to lose your soul in pursuit of mammon and all the vain pursuits of men, which offer no spiritual satisfaction, no lasting or permanent satisfaction. The world is a rat race and a trap which offers snares, temptations, and allures which deviate many from the preservation of their own soul and salvation. Or what shall a man give in exchange for his life? What would a man give in exchange for his life? Very few things, because the natural man, we are survival-oriented creatures, and as such our instincts for self-preservation will not allow us to lay down our life for anything so cheaply. The only reason that we would lay down our life, the only reason we die daily, is for the one whom we die daily for. So we have to not value our life as much as we once did before we became born again. For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinning generation, of him the Son of Man also shall be ashamed when he comes into the esteem of his Father with his sacred angels. Whoever is ashamed, now Paul was not ashamed, for I am not ashamed of the good news, Romans 1:16, for it is the power of salvation. But there are many closet Christians who are ashamed to make public professions and declarations and confessions of their faith. But if you are a closet Christian in a world that is adulterous and sinning, this nomenclature bleeds into the 15th verse, or the evil, rather the 11th, the 12th verse. This generation seeketh after a sign. The evil and sinning and adulterous generation, of course, demands the sign. But you have to take a stand in a world that is surrounded by wrong and just sinful, adultery people. You have to make a stand. You have to shine out as a light and as a lighthouse, leading others who are lost and astray in this fallen declaration. But you cannot do that if you are ashamed to proclaim your faith to others. So you reap what you sow. If you are ashamed of him in this life, he's going to be ashamed if you are ashamed to call yourself his own, he's going to be ashamed to call you his own when it matters most, when he returns in judgment with the army of angels. And the principle also has a parallel in Matthew's 10th, 32nd, and 33rd verse. He who confesses me before men, he shall confess before the Father, but those who deny him, he shall deny before his Father. So the same principle of perfect retaliatory retribution is embedded in the negative of Matthew and what we read of in Mark. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.